They say ruins are silent, but some are only holding their breath. Beyond the windswept plains lies Ani, a city that does not rest, a place where history is not remembered, but rewritten. Its gates have stood sealed for centuries, yet its shadow stretches across time, whispering to those who dare to listen. The stones speak in languages older than empires. The air carries a chill that does not belong to the season. And somewhere beneath the broken streets, something waits, patient, unseen, alive. Once you step inside, the city knows you. It learns your secrets, and it will never let you leave unchanged. They say the wind in Ani carries voices, not from the living, but from the city itself. It's a wind unlike any other, thin, sharp, and restless, as if it has been wandering for centuries without finding peace. If you stand alone on the high plateau, with nothing but the crumbling stones and the endless sky, it curls around your ears and whispers in syllables you can't quite understand. But your heart understands. It is the language of longing and loss. I had heard these stories before I ever saw the place. A name murmured in the corners of travel books, buried in the footnotes of forgotten histories. Ani, the city of 1,001 churches. Once the pride of an empire, now nothing but ruins. But there was something else too, something the official records never said. The few locals who spoke of Ani at all did so reluctantly, lowering their voices, glancing over their shoulders as if the city could overhear. They said Ani was not simply abandoned, it had been taken. Not by war alone, nor by time, but by something far older. The road to Ani is not a road so much as a scar across the land. The Armenian highlands stretch wide and bare, their windswept grasses broken only by black cliffs and the skeletons of walls that seem to rise directly from the earth itself. You can feel the age here before you see it, an ache in the air, as if the land remembers more than it should. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun burning low and orange over the plateau. From a distance, Ani appeared like a mirage, the jagged silhouettes of cathedrals and towers casting long shadows against the gold of the dying day. No sound but the wind, no movement but the slow drift of clouds. And yet, as I stood there, I could have sworn I felt something beneath my feet, a faint, rhythmic tremor, like the pulse of a sleeping giant. The village nearest Ani is small, a cluster of stone houses and narrow paths that seem to turn away from the plateau, as if the people here prefer not to look at the ruins. I stopped at the only tea house, where the air smelled of mint and wood smoke. The owner, an old man with eyes like wet stone, served me without asking questions. It was only when I mentioned Ani that his hand froze on the teapot. "You shouldn't go," he said flatly. I told him I had come all this way to see it. His gaze sharpened. "Many have come. Fewer have left. And those who do," he shook his head as though the words were too heavy to lift. "No one spends the night there and comes back the same." Others in the room had been pretending not to listen, but now their silence was thick and deliberate. One woman crossed herself. Another man muttered something in Armenian that I didn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. The old man leaned closer. "You think you'll find history there? Stones, carvings, the dust of centuries. But Ani is not a place for the past. It is a place for the present, yours. And once it takes it, you will have nothing left." I laughed softly, though it felt like the wrong response. "I'm only staying for a few hours." "Then be sure the hours stay with you," he said. The path to Ani narrows as it approaches the gates, winding between cliffs and the deep cut of the Equirian River. The closer I came, the more I noticed that even the birds avoided the ruins. They circled wide around the city, their cries faint and distant. The air grew colder, though the sun was still above the horizon. The gate itself loomed like the mouth of some vast creature, its arch carved with weathered patterns that might have been flowers or eyes. I touched the stone. It was colder than the air. My fingers came away with a fine dust that shimmered faintly in the light before vanishing into the wind. Inside, the city spread wide across the plateau. Streets still visible in the dust, buildings reduced to half-walls and jagged corners, towers leaning like tired sentinels. The great cathedral stood at the heart, roofless but still defiant, its arches framing the sky. There was beauty here still, but it was the beauty of bones. I walked slowly, letting the place speak in its own way. Every stone seemed to hum with memory. In my mind, I tried to picture it alive. The clang of blacksmiths at work, the murmur of markets thick with spices and silk, the echo of bells calling the faithful. And then, nothing. The breath of the city stolen in an instant. Historians say Ani fell to siege, to earthquakes, to shifting borders and economic collapse. But the way the walls crumble, the way the streets end abruptly as if erased, it feels like a single act, swift and merciless. As though the city had exhaled its last and simply stopped. I wandered deeper, past broken chapels and hollow doorways. Here and there, strange carvings marked the stones, not Armenian, not Georgian, not any script I recognized. They were looping, circular, almost like knots, but with a sense of movement that made them seem alive even in their stillness. I found myself tracing them with my fingers without thinking, the stone warm where the rest of the wall was cold. The sun was sinking fast now, staining the ruins in blood-red light. Shadows lengthened, filling the streets like dark water. I should have turned back, every instinct told me so. But there was something ahead, some pull I couldn't name. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind shifting through the arches. But no, wind doesn't laugh. This sound was soft, distant, but unmistakable. Laughter. Not the bright, careless laughter of the living, but something older. Slow, worn at the edges, like the voice of someone who has told the same joke for centuries and is still amused. It came from somewhere ahead, near the cathedral. My steps quickened, though a cold weight was building in my chest. As I approached, the sound grew clearer, weaving through the empty streets. It was joined by another laugh, and then another. I stopped in the cathedral's shadow. The laughter echoed all around now, threading through the stone like water through cracks. I spun, searching for movement, for figures, for anything. The streets were empty. The windows were dark. The city was silent, except for the laughter that was not mine. Then, from deep within the cathedral's shell, I saw it, the faintest flicker of light, like a candle guttering in the wind. I took a step toward it, and every voice fell silent. The wind rose sharply, whipping dust into my eyes. The candlelight vanished. In the sudden stillness, I realized my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then, just as quickly, the laughter returned. But this time, it was behind me. The gate didn't just guard the city, it watched it. Even from a distance, I could see them, the eyes. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, carved into the archway that towered above the ruined road. At first, they seemed random, a jumble of shapes weathered by centuries of wind. But the closer I came, the more deliberate they became. Eyes upon eyes, layered and overlapping, wide and unblinking, staring in every direction. No two alike. Some were narrow and sharp, others round and soft, some lidless and cold, others almost human in their sadness. The wind hissed through the stones, carrying with it the faint rasp of sand against my boots. I stopped a few paces away. Something in me resisted stepping closer, as if the gate's gaze was not a thing to be taken lightly. The eyes seemed to weigh me, to strip me of the layers I presented to the world. They were not looking at me, they were looking through me. It was then that the strangest sensation crept over me. I was being measured. Not in the way a person might size up a stranger on the street, but in the way a jeweler might hold a gem to the light, searching for flaws. My breath caught. A deep and ancient instinct told me that whatever the gate saw, it could not be lied to. I stepped forward anyway. The stone was dark basalt, veined with paler streaks that made the eyes seem alive, as if light moved faintly beneath the surface. I reached out and brushed my fingertips against one. The stone was cool, too cool for the afternoon sun, and smoother than the surrounding wall, as though touched often. My skin tingled where it met the carving. In that instant, the world shifted. It was not a vision, not exactly. More like the air around me deepened, thickened, and I was standing in Ani's golden age. The road behind me teemed with merchants, their carts piled high with bolts of silk, baskets of figs, pottery painted in colors richer than any I had seen. The smell of baking bread and roasting lamb drifted on the breeze, mingling with the sharper scent of fresh-cut cedar from the carpenter's quarter. Bells rang in the distance, not one, but dozens, each from a different church. And above it all, the gate's eyes glimmered in the sunlight, just as they did now. Only here, they were not weathered. They were sharp, perfect, polished by human hands. Men and women passed beneath them without hesitation, but I noticed how no one looked up. Not once. In that moment, I understood the truth. The gate was not for keeping enemies out. It was for keeping lies out. The city's own chronicles, those that survived, spoke of Ani's fierce pride and justice. No thief could escape the markets, no traitor could hide in the court, no false prophet could poison the ears of the faithful. Not because the people were perfect, but because the gate itself saw truth. It was said that if you passed beneath it with a false heart, you would not make it to the other side. I watched through that strange veil of time as a man approached, richly dressed, with rings on every finger and a smile too easy to trust. He walked boldly, but as he neared the gate, his steps faltered. The crowd slowed, watching. The man's smile cracked. By the time he stood in the archway, his face had gone pale. Then, before my eyes, every carved eye turned toward him. The stone itself seemed to shift, pupils narrowing, focusing. He froze, trembling. And then, without a word, he turned and fled the way he had come. The crowd did not follow. They only nodded to one another, as though the city had been spared a small but certain poison. The vision faded as suddenly as it had come, leaving me standing alone in the present again, my hands still resting against the cold stone. The wind sighed through the arch. I shivered, though the day was still warm. As I stepped back, I noticed something else. Many of the eyes had tiny cracks in them now, as though they had been crying stone tears for centuries. And yet, some seemed untouched by time. Smooth, hope, watching. I thought of the old man in the tea house, warning me that Ani was not a place for the past but for the present. The idea took on new weight here. What would the gate see in me? What would it decide? The sun was sliding lower toward the horizon, casting the arch into long shadows that stretched like fingers across the dust. I could almost imagine them curling toward me. But there was only one way forward. I took a deep breath and stepped beneath the gate of 1,000 eyes. Immediately, a weight settled on me, like invisible hands pressing against my shoulders. The air was heavier here, thicker, as though the space between the two great pillars existed in a different layer of the world. I kept walking, but every step felt deliberate, measured. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The carvings were subtle, they had not shifted in position, but the pupils, I swear, were turning. Slowly, following me. I tried to focus on the road ahead. Beyond the gate lay the heart of Ani, and in my mind's eye I still saw the vision. The bustling streets, the soaring churches, the markets alive with sound and color. But the city before me was not the one from that memory. It was broken, empty. Shadows pooled in the hollows of collapsed roofs. Grass grew between the stones where once there had been polished avenues. And yet the gate still watched. Halfway through, a sudden chill swept through me, as though I had walked into a cloud of winter air. My breath fogged in front of me. A sound rose faintly in my ears, not laughter as before, but something closer to a murmur. Words, perhaps, too low to catch, too many voices to follow. I glanced up at the carvings and my heart skipped. They were blinking. Not in unison. Here and there, a lid would close, slow and deliberate, and then open again. The cracks in the stone seemed deeper now, the eyes older, more tired. But the gaze was no less piercing. I thought of the countless people who must have passed through here. Traders, priests, soldiers, kings. Lovers fleeing under cover of night. Thieves hoping to disappear into the crowd. How many had the gate stopped? How many had it let pass, knowing what they carried within them? The murmurs grew louder. My chest tightened. I took another step, and another, and with each, the sensation of being weighed grew sharper. It was not just my actions the gate measured. It was my thoughts, my fears, the things I had done, and the things I had considered doing. I tried to keep walking, but something in me hesitated. The gate wanted something from me. Not a confession, it already knew, but an acknowledgement. A truth I had carried too long. And so, without speaking aloud, I thought of it. The one thing I would not tell anyone. The one memory I kept locked deep in my mind. The gate seemed to shiver as though satisfied. The murmurs fell silent. Then all at once it happened. Every single eye, every carving from the base to the highest point of the arch, closed. The sound was like 1,000 dry leaves brushing together, a whispering sigh that swept over me. Shadows rushed inward, swallowing the space beneath the gate. For the briefest heartbeat, I stood in darkness so complete I could not see my own hands. And then the eyes opened again. But now they were different. The pupils were gone, leaving only blank stone where moments ago there had been life. The gate had finished watching me. I stepped forward into the city, my legs unsteady. Behind me, the wind rose again, threading through the carvings. If there was a sound in it now, I could not hear it, or perhaps I simply dared not listen. Somewhere ahead, deeper in the ruins, a bell rang. Low and hollow, as if from a great distance. I turned toward it, and did not see the shadow that slipped through the gate behind me. Some say Ani's greatest cathedral was built not for the living, but for those buried beneath. It stood ahead of me now, a hollow giant against the pale sky, the Cathedral of Ani. Even in ruin, it commanded the city. Its surviving walls rose like the ribs of some great beast long dead, their black and red stones catching the late light. The roof was gone, but the sky framed itself in its arches like a ceiling of shifting clouds. The wind whispered through the broken windows, making the emptiness hum with an almost musical sadness. I stepped into the cathedral's shadow, and the air grew cooler. The ground here was smooth, worn by centuries of feet. Moss clung to the base of the pillars. I could almost hear the echo of 1,000 voices chanting, though the space was empty now. The cathedral's story was famous in what little history survived. It was said to have been built at the height of Ani's glory, when its population swelled to 100,000, its markets filled with goods from every corner of the Silk Road. But there was something odd about the way it was built, something no scholar could fully explain. Its measurements were unlike any other church of its time. The proportions were strange, perfect in ways that seemed unnatural, as though designed with a knowledge far beyond the age. That knowledge belonged to one man, the master architect, David Ainitz. His name was carved in the stones above the great door, though the letters were almost gone now. He had come to Ani as a young man, a builder already renowned for his skill. But when asked how he had learned the art of design, he gave an answer that unsettled those who heard it. "I dream them," he said simply. "The buildings are given to me while I sleep. I only remember them." The king at the time, Gajik I, had been intrigued, and so he had given David a commission to build a cathedral unlike any in the world, one that would stand until the end of days. David accepted without hesitation, and that was when the dreams began to change. According to fragments of an old chronicle, a copy of a copy, smudged and faded, David told the king that the cathedral's design came to him not in visions of heaven, but in voices. Many voices, speaking at once, too many to count. They whispered numbers, ratios, precise lengths and heights. They spoke of corridors and spaces hidden from view, of chambers far beneath the earth. David did not question them. He drew exactly what they told him. There were murmurs among the workers during the building. The foundation was deeper than any cathedral needed to be. Long passages were carved into the bedrock, though no one knew their purpose. David oversaw everything with tireless precision, sleeping only in short bursts, enough, he said, to keep the dreams coming. When the cathedral was finished, it was the crown jewel of Ani. Its walls glowed in the sun, its bells could be heard for miles. But the people noticed something strange. The air inside was always cool, even in the heat of summer. And when you stood in the center of the nave, you could hear a faint sound, a low, constant hum, like breath drawn and never released. I thought of this as I wandered now through its empty shell. The pillars rose like forest trunks, the arches stretching overhead as though trying to touch the divine. The floor was cracked in places, revealing glimpses of the foundation beneath. Dust floated in the shafts of light that poured through the broken roof. I traced my hand along the stone walls, feeling the faint ridges of chisel marks made 1,000 years ago. It was then that I heard it, faint, almost imagined at first. A sound beneath the sigh of the wind. A murmur. No, chanting. I froze. The sound seemed to come from below my feet, rising through the stone like heat through a hearth. It was low, rhythmic, in a language I could not understand. Not loud enough to be human voices here and now. It was as though the floor itself remembered the songs once sung above it. My mind flashed to the rumors that the cathedral had not been built for the worship of the living, but as a vessel for the dead. That its true congregation lay buried beneath, in chambers designed with mathematical perfection to preserve their remains, and perhaps their voices. I walked toward the center of the nave, the chanting growing stronger, though it never became clear. The air thickened around me. My footsteps echoed in a strange way, the sound stretching unnaturally, as if the space below was vast and hollow. In the far corner, near a collapsed section of wall, I noticed something odd. A flagstone that sat slightly higher than the rest. It was smooth, but worn unevenly, as if it had been lifted many times. I knelt and pressed my hand against it. It shifted beneath my palm, a fraction at first, then more. Dust rose in a thin cloud. The chanting seemed to swell in my ears, though no one was there. I pushed harder, and the stone tilted upward with a slow, reluctant groan. Beneath it, the darkness opened like a mouth. The opening revealed a spiral staircase of black stone, its steps worn and glistening faintly, as though polished by the passage of many feet. The air that rose from it was cold and dry, smelling faintly of iron and something older, something like the inside of a sealed tomb. I leaned closer, peering into the descent. The steps wound tightly downward, disappearing into shadows that swallowed the last traces of daylight. The chanting was clearer now, not loud, but persistent, a heartbeat of voices that seemed to come from deep within the earth. A shiver ran through me. I thought of David Ainetz, alone in his bed, whispering measurements in his sleep. Of the workers carving stone in the dark, their lamps casting shapes that never touched the light above. Of the people of Ani standing in this very cathedral, unaware of the congregation beneath their feet. I reached out to steady myself against the edge of the opening, and the stone beneath my hand was warm. Not the warmth of the sun. This was different. Like something living. My breath caught. The voices below paused. Just for a heartbeat. Then, as if aware of me, they began again. Slower now, deeper, each word a drop of water in an endless well. I hesitated at the top of the staircase, the dark pulling at me like a tide. And then, the flagstone behind me shifted again, closing with a sound like the final toll of a bell. There's music no mortal voice should sing. It drew me downwards, step by slow step, into the earth. The spiral staircase clung to the inside of a narrow shaft, its stones slick beneath my boots. The walls were damp, glistening faintly in the light that trickled down from the cathedral above. The voices rose from the depths, echoing in a language I had never heard, not Latin, not Armenian, not any tongue I could name. Yet its cadence struck something deep in me, a rhythm that felt older than any written word. The cold deepened as I descended. My breath fogged before me, curling upward into the darkness I'd left behind. With every turn of the staircase, the light from above grew fainter until it was gone entirely, replaced by a dim glow below. It was not the flicker of torches or lamps, but something softer, a pale, steady radiance, like moonlight filtered through deep water. The air smelled of stone and dust, and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron. My hand trailed the wall as I went, and now and then I felt deep grooves carved into the stone, shapes that curled and looped beneath my fingertips. They were the same patterns I had traced on the cathedral's outer walls earlier, only here they were sharper, untouched by weather, almost fresh. The voices grew clearer. It was not a song in the way one might hear in a church, no soaring melody, no harmony designed for beauty. This was a chant that pulsed like a heartbeat, rising and falling in waves. The sound seemed to reach through my ears into my chest, until I felt it vibrating in my ribs. The stairs ended abruptly, spilling me into a vast chamber. My first breath caught. I stood in a hall carved entirely from the bedrock, its ceiling high and arched like the cathedral above. Only here, the arches were formed from rows of bones. Human bones, bleached pale, fitted together so precisely they seemed like a single piece of architecture. Skulls were set in the walls like ornaments, their hollow eyes staring into the darkness. Along the center of the hall stretched a long aisle, flanked on either side by stone shelves that ran from floor to ceiling. Upon them sat bones, entire skeletons, each seated upright as though attending some eternal service. Rusted crowns rested on the skulls of some, tarnished ornaments on others. These were no common dead. They had been kings, queens, priests, and generals, their remains preserved in silent rows. And there, at the far end of the hall, in the shadow of a great arch, moved the choir. They were robed figures, their garments a deep, heavy black that drank in the pale glow. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, their hands folded together as they swayed with the rhythm of the chant. The glow in the chamber seemed to come from them, not from any flame or lamp, but from the robes themselves, as if woven with threads of trapped moonlight. I stood frozen, unwilling to step further yet unable to turn back. The sound pressed into me, into my bones, filling my mind with shapes and places I had never seen. Images flashed behind my eyes. A city of gold under a black sky, a river running uphill, a throne carved from obsidian. And always the cathedral, but new, whole, and crowned in light. Something in the chant shifted. I felt the attention of the robed figures turn toward me, though none had yet looked up. Their voices rose together, the sound twisting until it felt like the air itself was folding around me. The aisle between the shelves yawned before me like a path I could not refuse. I began to walk. The floor was made of great stone slabs, their edges worn smooth by countless feet. The crowned skulls seemed to watch as I passed, their empty sockets somehow heavier than the eyes of the living. In the spaces between the shelves, I saw alcoves leading to other tunnels, narrow passages disappearing into blackness. Faint whispers echoed from them, as though the dead themselves were murmuring secrets they could not speak aloud. Halfway down the aisle, I noticed something strange. Among the crowned skeletons, there were others, figures seated upright but wrapped in ancient cloth, their faces and hands still covered. These bodies had not yet given themselves fully to bone. And though I knew it was impossible, I thought I saw the faintest rise and fall of their chests. The choir's song swelled as I neared them. The air grew warmer now, thick, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer to listen. My steps slowed. The glow from the robed figures spilled over the floor like mist. Then, as one, they turned toward me. Their hoods hid their faces, but the light caught on the curve of their chins, the edges of their mouths. I could feel their eyes behind the fabric, heavy and unblinking. The chant did not stop. It only changed, the rhythm slowing, the notes drawing out until each word seemed to last an eternity. I was close enough now to see that the robes were not cloth at all, but something else entirely, a weave of hair, thousands of strands, braided and knotted together. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. Whose hair? How many heads had been shorn to clothe these singers? The nearest figure stepped forward, its movements fluid, almost gliding. It raised a hand and beckoned me closer. My feet obeyed without my consent. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. When I stood only an arm's length away, the figure reached up and took hold of its hood. Slowly, deliberately, it drew the hood back. I was staring into my own face. It was me, but not me. The skin was pale, almost gray, the eyes deep-set and shining faintly with that same unearthly glow. The mouth was neither smiling nor frowning, only still. And yet the moment our eyes met, I felt something move between us, like a thread pulled taut. My breath caught in my throat. The figure opened its mouth and the voice that came out was mine. My tone, my cadence, speaking in that same impossible language. I could not understand the words, but I knew their meaning all the same. You are not a visitor here. You are a return. The rest of the choir turned their faces toward me then, and in each hood I saw the same thing, my own reflection, in different states of age and decay. Some were young, others old, others little more than bone. Each one sang with the same voice, my voice, weaving together into the endless chant. The ground beneath me shifted. I looked down to see the stone slab under my feet beginning to tilt, the edges lifting. A crack split across its center, revealing darkness below. The chanting grew deafening, pressing against my skull until my vision blurred. The slab tilted further, my balance slipping. The faces before me swayed in unison, their mouths opening wider, the chant now a single drawn note that filled every inch of space. And then, with a sudden drop, the stone gave way entirely. I fell into the darkness beneath. The last thing I saw, those endless faces, my faces, watching from above. History records wars and plagues, but never rivers that flow in reverse. I remember falling, the cold rushing up to meet me, and then landing on something not solid, not liquid, but somewhere in between. My vision swam in darkness. The chanting was gone. The faces above had vanished. Only a slow, rhythmic drip of water reached my ears. When I stood, I realized I was in a long tunnel carved from stone, the ceiling low enough to force me to bow my head. The air was damp and heavy, and the ground sloped gently downward. Somewhere ahead, far in the distance, there was a sound, faint but growing, the unmistakable roar of water. As I began to walk, my mind kept replaying what I had just seen in the choir chamber. My own faces, my own voice in an impossible chorus. The sensation of recognition still clung to me like wet cloth. I had no answers, but a deep, cold certainty told me that whatever this place was, I had not stumbled into it by chance. The tunnel turned sharply, and there, in the wall, I saw carvings. Not the looping, abstract symbols I'd seen before, but actual figures. They were crude but powerful. A line of people kneeling before what looked like a vast river, its waves carved in thick, curling lines. Above the river loomed a figure, tall, robed, faceless. In its hands, it held something, a small circle, radiating lines like the sun. Beneath the carvings, the stone was worn smooth, as if countless hands had touched it in passing. And faintly, in the center of the carving, I saw a groove that led downward. A channel, perhaps, for water. I stared at it for a long moment before the memory of an old story returned to me. Not my story, but one I had read long ago in a library that smelled of dust and iron ink. It was written by a man named Mir Zakarian, a historian of Ani who had lived in its final years. His words, preserved in fragments, had been dismissed by scholars as superstition, but I had never forgotten them. He wrote of the night before Ani's fall. The Akurian River had always been the city's lifeblood, winding around its cliffs like a silver serpent, its waters feeding the fields and powering the mills. The people believed it was a gift, a pact between the city and whatever ancient force had shaped the land. In return, the river was to be honored, never crossed in anger, never used for bloodshed. But in the year of the Great Hunger, the pact was broken. It began when the king, desperate for resources to fund his armies, ordered the river diverted to flood the lands of Ani's enemies downstream. It was a clever tactic, and it worked. Those lands drowned, their crops lost, their people scattered. The city celebrated, never thinking what price would come. That night, Mir wrote, the river changed. He described hearing it before seeing it, a low, thunderous rumble that made the ground quake. When he reached the banks, he saw the impossible. The water was rising, not spilling forward toward the plains, but curling back upon itself, climbing upstream with unnatural force. The current tore away boats, fish, and whole trees, dragging them backward against the natural flow. Bridges snapped like twigs, their stones swallowed whole. Mills collapsed into the churning black water. The roar grew until it drowned out all other sound. And then came the stench, a smell like rotting earth and old blood. Panic swept the city. Some said it was a curse, that the river's spirit had turned its back. Others claimed they saw shapes moving within the water, vast, twisting forms that surfaced only for moments before vanishing again. But all agreed on one thing. This was not water anymore. This was something older, something alive. By dawn, the river had returned to its normal course. But the city was changed. The crops failed that year. The air grew colder, and people began to disappear. Mir's final note before the chronicle ended was a warning. When the river runs backward again, The city will not be spared a second time. The roar ahead of me grew louder, shaking me from the memory. My pace quickened. The tunnel walls grew slicker, the floor damp beneath my feet. Soon the sound was no longer distant but pressing all around me, a steady thunder that made my ribs vibrate. The air changed. It smelled of wet stone, but also of something else, something metallic, like the scent of rain on iron. A breeze began to rise from ahead, pushing against me as though the water itself was exhaling. And then I heard it, the first splash. It was small, almost delicate, as if a single drop had fallen into a still pool. But then came another and another, until the sound became a rapid patter. The walls glistened more brightly now, the glow of the water reflecting faintly in the tunnel's curve. I reached a widening in the passage, a circular chamber where the tunnel split into several smaller passages, each yawning into darkness. In the center of the chamber was a pool, its surface trembling under the impact of falling water from a narrow slit in the ceiling. The pool's edges were carved with the same river and robed figure motif I had seen earlier, only here, the carvings were deeper, almost gouged. The water within the pool swirled slowly, not toward the outer tunnels, but in the opposite direction, spiraling inward as though being drawn down into the earth. The motion was hypnotic, unnatural. My eyes followed the whirl until I saw it, a dark hole at the center, wide enough for a man to pass through. The roar was coming from there. I knelt beside the pool, and as I peered into the hole, a blast of cold air surged upward, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of rushing water. But this was no gentle current. It was a torrent, moving with the kind of force that could strip flesh from bone. And it was not flowing away from me, it was coming toward me. A strange vibration began under my hands, traveling up through my arms. The carvings at the pool's edge seemed to tremble. I pulled back instinctively and saw something move in the water. It was fast, just a shadow, but long, too long to be a fish. The spiral quickened. The roar deepened. I stumbled back, my breath clouding in the air. The pool was no longer swirling lazily but churning violently, the water pulling itself upward in defiance of gravity. And then I heard it, the sound that did not belong. Beneath the roar, beneath the hiss of water on stone, there was something else. Voices. They were faint, distorted by the rushing water, but they were speaking in unison. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the intent, a warning, or perhaps a summons. The water surged higher, climbing the walls of the pool, spilling over the edge in streams that raced toward the tunnel floor. The cold bit into my skin like knives. The carvings beneath the water glowed faintly now, the robed figure's faceless head tilted down toward the hole as though in command. I turned to run, but the sound behind me grew sharper, a crashing, pounding rush like an oncoming wave. I glanced back in time to see the water erupt from the hole in a column, spraying the ceiling before collapsing outward in a flood. It moved not away from me, but toward me, against the slope of the floor. It was flowing backward. Every door in Ani once had a twin key, one for the owner and one for the city itself. That thought came to me not from a voice I heard, but from something deeper, as though the walls themselves had whispered it when the floodwaters pulled back. The tunnel was silent again now, the air thick with the metallic tang of wet stone. My clothes clung to me, and rivulets of water trickled past my boots, retreating into cracks in the floor. I followed the slope upward until the tunnel widened into a high-ceilinged hall. Here, the air was dry again, warmer somehow, as though I had stepped into a place sealed away from the world's breath for centuries. The walls were carved smooth, lined with alcoves. And in those alcoves hung keys. Hundreds of them. They were suspended on thin metal hooks, each key larger than my hand. All were rusted now, their teeth jagged and irregular, their bows shaped with strange artistry, some like flowers, others like animals, others still in looping patterns that seemed impossible to forge with the tools of their time. Above each alcove was an inscription, the letters weathered but still sharp enough to read. Names of places, families, or perhaps titles. I stepped closer. The first alcove bore the name House of Sarkeesian. The key beneath it had a bow shaped like a roaring lion's head, the teeth broad and heavy. In the next alcove, The name was Granary of the Eastern Gate. Its key was simpler, long and thin, but with a bow wrought into the shape of an open hand. I ran my fingers along the wall, tracing name after name: the Court of the Millers, the House of Bells, the Chamber of the Scribes. And then, at the far end, I found one alcove with no name at all. Only a smooth strip of stone where a name should have been, the letters perhaps carved once and later erased. The key here was unlike the others. It was blackened as though scorched by fire, and its bow was a perfect circle with no decoration, no flourish, nothing but its shape. I lifted it from its hook. It was heavier than it looked, the cold of it biting into my skin. For a moment I had the sensation, impossible but undeniable, that the key's weight was not just metal, but memory, as though it remembered what it had opened. The silence in the hall pressed in on me. I turned, taking in the sheer number of keys here. And I thought of the phrase I had heard once, long ago, in a fragment of Ani's forgotten law. The city holds the second key, for it must decide when to lock away its own. That law had always struck me as strange. It was one thing for a ruler to keep a master key for safety. But here, in Ani, the city itself was the keeper. And the city, as I was learning, had never been entirely inanimate. Old records, those rare scraps saved from the centuries, spoke of a master set of keys kept in a ceremonial hall beneath the cathedral. It was said they were forged when Ani was first founded, each one created alongside its twin. The first key went to the owner, the lord of a house, the guardian of a storehouse, the keeper of a temple. The second was kept here, in the city's keeping, so that if the owner broke trust, the city could lock their doors forever. But whispers hinted at another use. There were doors in Ani that no citizen claimed to own, doors that were always locked, their purpose never explained. The keys for those doors were kept here as well. And those were not for the living. As I walked between the alcoves, the light in the hall shifted. I could not tell from where it came. There were no torches, no lamps, but it brightened faintly, just enough to catch the edges of the keys. For an instant, I thought they moved. Only slightly, the way iron might tremble if drawn by a magnet. The idea that they were aware of me, aware of being seen, sent a cold weight into my stomach. I reached the center of the hall and found a great stone table. Upon it lay a long strip of parchment, brittle and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. It was a list, column after column of names, each followed by a symbol I recognized, a simple circle, the same shape as the bow of the black key in my hand. I could not read the names, but they stirred a sense of warning in me. Every instinct told me these were not people, but places, or perhaps events. A tremor ran through the floor, subtle but enough to make the parchment quiver. I glanced around the hall, my pulse quickening. The keys on the walls now swayed gently, each movement too synchronized to be chance. The tremor deepened, a low hum beneath my feet. And then, in the far corner of the hall, a sound began. Faint, metallic, repeating. A click, click, click. Like a lock being tested. Another tremor followed, stronger now. The alcoves rattled. A key fell from its hook, landing on the stone floor with a sound that seemed to echo far too loudly. I backed away instinctively, clutching the black key tighter. The clicking sound grew louder, joined by others. Dozens of them. The hall was filled with it now, a rising chorus of metal against metal, as though every key was turning in every lock it had ever known. The ground shook violently. Dust rained from the ceiling. The parchment on the table curled and tore in the vibration. And then I heard it. Above me, far above, through tons of stone and earth, came the groan of wood and iron long unused. It rolled through the air like thunder, followed by another and another. It took me a moment to understand what I was hearing. Doors. Every door in Ani. The sound was everywhere now. The creak of hinges straining after centuries, the crash of bolts sliding open, the shudder of gates breaking their own rust. In my mind's eye, I saw it, every locked place in the ruins swinging wide, every hidden chamber yawning into the air again. The tremor became a rumble, and the hall itself seemed to sway. The keys on the walls trembled harder, some leaping from their hooks entirely. I stumbled toward the exit, the black key still clenched in my fist, as the sound above rose to a deafening climax. Not just doors opening, but something else moving through them. Something that had been waiting for a very, very long time. They called her the Keeper of the Last Breath. The name rose unbidden in my mind the moment I stepped into the courtyard above the ceremonial Hall of Keys. I could not recall ever reading it in a book or hearing it whispered in any tale. And yet, there it was, as familiar as if I had known it all my life. The wind here was stronger than before, cold and restless, curling around the broken walls like a living thing. Ani was no longer silent. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the groan of gates newly opened, the echo of doors swinging wide after centuries of stillness. The sound carried across the ruins like the voices of old ghosts greeting one another after a long absence. The courtyard itself was empty, or so I thought. It was only when the wind shifted that I saw her. She stood at the far edge, her back to me, the folds of her white veil and gown rippling as though the air itself could not pass without touching her. She was motionless, yet the fabric seemed to move with a life of its own, wrapping and unwinding in patterns I could not follow. The sight froze me in place, not from fear, but from the absolute certainty that I had just stepped into someone else's story. I do not know how long I stood there before she turned her head slightly, enough for her voice to carry on the wind. "You opened the doors." Her words were not an accusation nor praise. They were simply true, and because they were true, they were heavy. I took a step toward her, and the wind shifted again, curling between us. She did not turn fully to face me, but her voice came once more. "You have the key." I glanced down at my hand. The blackened key from the nameless alcove was still there, cold as ice despite my grip. "You've been waiting for me?" I asked, though the words felt foolish even as I spoke them. She gave no answer, only turned her gaze out toward the ruins. The sky was beginning to darken now, clouds moving in fast from the horizon, their bellies low and heavy. The air tasted of iron. At last, she spoke again. "Do you know her story?" I didn't ask who. I didn't have to. "The last queen of Ani," she said, and her voice carried a depth that seemed to come from far beyond her own body. "The one who thought she could bargain with something that was not human." The wind surged, and suddenly the courtyard was gone. In its place, I stood on the balcony of a palace, whole, new, gleaming in the sun. Below, the city sprawled in all its glory, the streets alive with merchants, soldiers, children chasing one another between market stalls. Bells rang from the cathedral. The air was warm, golden live. And beside me stood the queen. She was tall, robed in deep crimson, her crown set with stones the color of fire. But it was her eyes that held me, not their beauty, but their hunger. She looked down upon the city as one might look upon a child who is already slipping away. Her voice was sharp, urgent. "It will fall," she said, though no one else was near. "The walls will break, the people will scatter, and all the power of kings will not save it." I followed her gaze to the horizon, where a darkness was rising. Not clouds, not storm, but something else. It moved like smoke, but faster, and I felt the temperature drop even as I watched. "They will come for the city," she said, "and for me." She turned to face me then, or perhaps I was only standing in the place of some long-forgotten witness. "But I will not let Ani die," she said. "I will find a way." And she did. She left the palace that night alone, her crown hidden, her footsteps silent in the narrow streets. She crossed the outer gates, passed beyond the city walls, and walked into the wilderness where no guard would follow. For 3 days she traveled, until the land turned to broken rock and the air grew so still that not even the wind dared pass through. There, in the hollow of a great black stone, she found it. It was not a person, not an animal, not even a shape one could name. It was presence, a darkness that seemed deeper than shadow, bending the air around it. And it spoke to her, not in words, but in the way stone might speak to water, slow, relentless, undeniable. It told her that Ani could be saved, that its walls could stand forever, that its people could escape the hunger and plague that had begun to creep upon them. All it asked was her voice, the last breath she would ever speak as herself. The queen agreed. She returned to Ani changed. Her eyes no longer searched the horizon. They fixed on it as if it had already been conquered. Her voice, when she spoke, was different, softer, but carrying farther, like wind moving through a hollow space. For a time, the city flourished again. Crops grew where they should not. The river ran full. No enemy army dared approach. But the people began to whisper. They said the queen no longer slept, that she walked the streets at night, veiled in white, her steps silent, her head turning toward closed doors as though counting them. And those who met her gaze found themselves unable to speak, as if she had taken their breath and kept it for herself. The bargain had its price. The day the river ran backwards, the queen stood at the cathedral gates, her veil billowing though there was no wind. The people begged her to act, to call upon whatever power she had bound herself to. She did, and the city died anyway. When it was over, they found no trace of her in the palace, the cathedral, or the streets. But sometimes, when the wind rose suddenly in the ruins, it carried a sound, a faint, almost human sigh. They called her, the woman beside me said now, the keeper of the last breath, for she carries still the breath she gave away, and those she has taken since. The courtyard returned around us. The wind coiled between us like a serpent. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Her head tilted slightly. Because you carry a door's key, and some doors do not open for wood and iron. They open for breath. She began to turn toward me fully. The wind tightened, whipping her veil into a frenzy. I felt it pulling at me, drawing me forward even as every instinct screamed to step back. Her hands rose to her head, and then the veil slipped. Beneath it was no human face, only the pale, cold perfection of carved stone. The eyes were empty, and yet I felt them on me as surely as if they were alive. The wind roared, and she stepped forward. The morning Ani died, daylight never came. The woman in the wind, the stone-faced phantom who had stepped toward me with the veil torn away, was gone. Whether she had vanished into the air or I had simply lost the thread of reality in her presence, I couldn't say. But the wind she commanded had stilled, leaving the ruins heavy with a silence that felt staged, as if the city had drawn in its breath to tell me something, and the telling would not be gentle. I turned, and the world shifted. Stone beneath my feet was no longer crumbling ruin, but smooth, freshly swept flagstones. The air smelled not of dust and cold iron, but of warm bread and the faint tang of river water on a summer morning. And though I could not see myself, I was no longer moving with my own weight and stride. The world was lower, the angles different, and then I understood. I was seeing through someone else's eyes. A child's. Small hands clutched the edge of a wooden stall in the marketplace. The square should have been crowded, filled with the shouts of vendors selling spices, fabrics, and figs, with the jangle of coins, the bark of dogs, the stamp of horse hooves. But there was only stillness. Stalls stood open, the goods untouched. Bread sat in baskets, still warm, but no hands reached for it. The bells were silent. Ani's bells were never silent. I turned, or rather, the child turned, scanning for a parent, a neighbor, anyone. But the street stretched out empty. Curtains hung unmoving in open windows. Doors stood ajar, as though the people inside had simply stepped out a moment ago and never returned. Then I looked up. The sky above Ani had always been blue in the mornings, the kind of sharp, unbroken blue that only came at this high plateau. But now it was black. Not the black of night, where stars might glitter and the moon might hang. This was absolute, swallowing black, as though the sky itself had been scraped away to reveal a void behind it. And yet the city was lit, not with sunlight, but with some strange, sourceless glow that seemed to come from the air itself. It cast no shadows, no warmth. Everything was visible, and nothing was alive. I, the child, began to walk, my bare feet whispering over stone. Down an alley, past the baker's shop with its bread cooling in neat rows, the smell teasing but faint, as though the air itself had been muffled. A cat lay in the doorway, unmoving. Its eyes were open. The further I went, the stronger the feeling grew that I was being watched. Not by eyes in windows, nor from behind doors, but from above. That black sky pressed down like a weight, and though I could see no shape in it, I felt it looking back. I came to the great square before the cathedral. The doors were open wide, and for a moment I thought I saw people inside, figures moving in the gloom. Relief surged and I stepped forward. But as I crossed the square, the shapes resolved into something else. Not people. Shadows, standing upright, featureless, unmoving. I stopped. The shadows did not move, but the air between them seemed to shift, as though they were holding back something unseen, something that pressed outward and could not pass. The child's breath came quick now, small and sharp. Then the sound began. It was not loud. It was barely more than a whisper at first, but it came from everywhere, from the streets, from the sky, from the spaces between the stones. Words I could not understand, spoken in a cadence like the slow turning of a wheel. The pitch rose and fell in a way that made the hair at the back of the child's neck stand on end. I turned to run. Down streets I knew, though they were not my streets. Past houses whose doors were open to empty rooms. Through the market where the bread still lay, cooling, untouched. The voice, or voices, followed, neither closer nor further away, as though they had no distance to cross. When I finally stopped, bent over and gasping, I found myself in the narrow lane that led to my home, the child's home. The door was closed. That was wrong. We had left it open when we went to the market. I pushed it open. Inside, the house was dark. Too dark. The sourceless glow that lit the streets did not reach here. I stepped in, my bare foot finding the rug in the entryway. The air was heavy still. I took another step, and the door closed behind me without a sound. I knew then, without knowing how, that there was no one left in Ani. Not in the houses, not in the streets, not in the cathedral. The people had not fled. They had not screamed. They had simply ceased. The child sank to the floor, small hands gripping the rug, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for it to open again. But it never did. The vision broke. I was back in the ruins, the market long crumbled, the cathedral a roofless skeleton against the horizon. My own breath was fast, my hands shaking. The sky above was still blue, but the light was fading fast. Night was coming, and as the last color drained from the horizon, I looked up. The stars had already come out. They should have been familiar, the same constellations that have hung over these lands for thousands of years. But they were wrong. Their patterns bent into shapes I did not know, curves and lines that drew symbols in the dark. I could not name them. No astronomer could. Yet as I stared, I felt a pull in my chest, the same pull that had brought me here to begin with. And I knew, without knowing how, that these stars were not just watching. They were remembering. And they remembered me. Some books tell history. This one changes it. The stars above me still burned in the wrong shapes, constellations twisted into symbols that no chart could name. Their strange geometry gnawed at the edges of my thoughts as I walked through the ruins. Every turn of the broken streets seemed to place those alien patterns directly overhead, as if the sky itself was following me. I didn't know where I was going until I found myself standing before what remained of Ani's library. The facade still bore traces of its former grandeur. Tall, arched windows now empty of glass, columns cracked but upright, fragments of carved script running along the lintels. The entrance gaped wide, a hollow mouth opening into shadow. A cold draft whispered from within, carrying the faint, dry scent of old paper. Impossible, I thought, for any parchment to have survived 1,000 years in the open air. I stepped inside. The roof had collapsed in many places, and shafts of moonlight poured down in silver beams, dust motes swirling lazily through them. The floor was a mosaic of shattered tile and rubble. Shelves lined the walls, their wooden frames rotted and splintered, many leaning drunkenly against the stone. Most were empty. Others held only heaps of blackened, crumbling fragments, the ashes of books too delicate to withstand time's breath. And yet, there was something here. I felt it before I saw it, a subtle pull in my chest, the same sensation that had led me to the gate, to the keys, to the woman in the wind. It was not the room that pulled at me, but something deeper, as though the library's shadow concealed another shadow. I followed the sensation to the far corner, where a narrow staircase led upward to a balcony that ringed the room. Up here, the shelves were less damaged, though their contents were no less decayed. I traced my fingers along the spines of the few remaining books, their titles worn away. And then my hand stopped. It was not dust, not rot, but leather, smooth, supple, intact. The book sat alone on a shelf otherwise empty, its dark brown cover uncracked, its surface marked only by a single symbol pressed into the leather, a circle within which a single line cut vertically, like a wound. I lifted it carefully. It was heavier than I expected, the weight not just physical but expectant. The air around me seemed to still, the sound of the wind outside fading. I opened it. The first page was blank. The second as well. Page after page, all untouched, the parchment pale and clean. Disappointment flickered through me, and then I turned another page and froze. Words were appearing. They bled onto the page in dark ink, curling into letters in my own language, my own handwriting. I watched as the penless strokes formed with deliberate precision, as though written by an invisible hand. The first sentence was simple enough. He stands in the library of Ani. I swallowed. The next line formed even as I read the first. The book in his hands is older than the city itself. I glanced around the balcony, half expecting to find someone watching me. The shadows were still. The dust swirled lazily in the beams of moonlight. I looked back at the page. New words formed. He turns the page. My hand moved without thought, flipping to the next sheet. Again, the ink appeared, shaping my own handwriting. He does not yet know that he will leave this place with the book. My pulse quickened. This was no historian's record. This was not the past. It was unfolding in real time, describing me even as I acted. I tried to test it, to break whatever trick this was. I closed the book. The library returned to normal around me. The air was cool and still. But when I opened the book again, the words were waiting, followed by new lines appearing fresh. He thinks to leave it here, to walk away and forget. But he will not. I felt a chill spread across my shoulders. My grip on the leather tightened. Slowly, I set the book back on the shelf. The ink formed again. He lies to himself. I backed away. My heels struck the balcony's wooden railing. My breath came faster now, though the air felt thin. I wanted to leave, to get away from this thing. But another thought crept in, quiet and insidious. If the book could write what I was doing now, could it also write what would happen next? I stepped forward again, heart pounding, and turned a fresh page. He asks the book a question. The words were already there before I had even thought of what to ask. What is going to happen to me? I whispered aloud. The ink bloomed slowly this time, each letter drawn with care. You will walk streets that are not there. You will open doors that do not lead where they should. And you will see faces that should be gone. I swallowed hard. My throat felt dry. I turned another page. You will find them. The penless hand paused. I waited, my eyes fixed on the page. Then the writing continued. And they will find you. I did not want to know who they were. But my fingers kept turning the pages, each one filling with words as fast as I could read. He will not sleep again in this city. He will know why the river turned. He will carry something that was never his. The lines came faster now, the ink darker, as though the hand writing them pressed harder into the page. He will see Ani as it was, and as it will be when it wakes. I stopped turning. My fingers trembled. And yet, there were so many pages left. The temptation was a weight pulling me down. I turned one more. The ink spread in careful strokes, slower than before, as though savoring each word. And then he looked up and saw them. I felt the air in the library shift. A pressure, a subtle vibration in the wooden planks beneath my feet. And something behind me moved. They say Ani fell in a siege, yet no enemy was ever seen. I didn't move. Not at first. The library still held that breathless stillness from the moment the book wrote its last line, and then he looked up and saw them. I could feel them still lingering behind me, in the way the air pressed against my back, in the faint hum of the floorboards beneath my boots. But when I turned, the balcony was empty. And yet, the light in the room had changed. The moonlight filtering through the collapsed roof felt thinner, as though stretched too far. Dust hung suspended in the air, caught mid-drift, frozen in some imperceptible pause. I descended the stairs to the library floor, the book still clutched in my hand. My footsteps echoed strangely, not sharp, but muffled, as though the walls themselves were trying not to hear. The moment I stepped outside into the ruins, the night air rushed over me, heavy with a sudden damp chill. The stars above still burned in their wrong patterns. But it wasn't the sky that pulled me forward now, it was the sound. A deep, resonant boom. It came from the far side of the city, where the outer walls stood in jagged silhouette against the hills. It was the kind of sound stone makes when it's struck with terrible force, but muted, as though swallowed before it could echo. I followed it, weaving through alleys where weeds had grown taller than the crumbled walls beside them. The air was colder here, my breath slower, my muscles tightening against an instinct I couldn't name. And then I saw them. The walls. They rose high above the plain, even in ruin, slabs of black and red stone fitted so precisely that a blade could not have slipped between them when they were new. Towers still stood at intervals, their upper halves shattered but their bases rooted deep in the earth. From here, I could see the massive gates that had once guarded the road into the city. They hung crooked on their hinges, the wood splintered outward, as though some vast force had burst through from the inside. That detail stopped me. The gates had not been broken into Ani. They had been broken out. The ancient records had been clear, or as clear as fragments written in the margins of fading scrolls could be. Mir Zakarian, the same historian who had written of the river's reversal, described nights when the city walls shook without warning. The tremors came not from siege engines or armies, but from within the city itself. In his account, the guards had stood their posts, staring outward into empty darkness, while the stones beneath their feet vibrated like a drum. The towers groaned, their foundations shifting, and yet no enemy approached. Still, the walls buckled in places, hairline cracks spreading until whole sections threatened to collapse. Then came the gates. According to Mir, the Great Western Gate had splintered one night with such violence that men standing near it were flung to the ground. But no ram had struck it, no hand had pushed. It had burst outward as though the city were expelling something, or someone, from its heart. I reached the base of the wall, my hand brushing over the deep fissures in the stone. The cold here was sharper, biting into my fingertips until they ached. The air felt thin, almost brittle, and carried a faint scent like snow, impossible in this summer heat. That was when I saw the weapons. They lay in a shallow trench near the wall, half buried in weeds and rubble. Siege engines, or the beginnings of them. A mangonel with its throwing arm half raised, the ropes stiff with age. A ballista pointed toward the city instead of away, as though it had been abandoned mid-turn. The wood was gray and cracked, but not as much as it should have been. It was as if the moment they'd been left here, time had only just begun to touch them, and they were covered in frost. I knelt, brushing my fingers over the thin white film that coated the wood and iron. The frost did not melt beneath my touch. Instead, it seemed to sink deeper, biting into the grain of the wood like something alive. My breath plumed in front of me, slow and ghostly. I stood and looked toward the gates again. The splintered wood glistened faintly in the moonlight, not with moisture, but with that same impossible frost. It traced the cracks and ran down the edges of the shattered planks, as though something cold had passed through here, leaving its breath on every surface it touched. The boom came again. This time it was closer, deep and resonant enough to thud in my chest. The wall shivered faintly, dust spilling from its seams. And then, from somewhere beyond the gates, came another sound, low, steady, and horribly familiar. It was the sound of something breathing. I took a step back, instinct pulling me away from the opening. The breath came again, and this time it was followed by a slow scraping, like stone dragged over stone. In my mind's eye, I could see the scene as Mir Zakarian must have seen it on those nights. The guards gripping their spears, their eyes fixed on the empty plain, while the ground quaked and the gates groaned without cause. The frost creeping across the wood. The air growing so cold that breath hung like smoke, even in summer. A shadow shifted beyond the gates. It was subtle at first, just the kind of movement your eyes tell you not to trust. But then the moonlight caught it. something vast, sliding against the ground, its surface rough like rock, its edges indistinct as if wrapped in fog. It paused, and the breathing deepened, sending another gust of icy air spilling through the splintered wood. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't even tell if it had one. But I knew it was looking at me. The frost spread under my boots, a thin crackling film that traced outward from the gates, creeping over the stones of the courtyard and up the bases of the wall. My fingers were numb now, my breath heavy and white in the dark. The summer air was gone, replaced by a cold so deep it seemed to seep into my bones. And then, silence. The breathing stopped. The scraping ceased. The boom did not come again. For a moment, I thought it had gone. But as I turned to leave, the frost beneath my boots shifted, splitting in a delicate, intricate pattern, not like ice breaking, but like something beneath it was pushing upward. And then the frost began to climb my legs. Once you crossed the bridge to Ani, you could never leave as yourself. The frost still clung to my boots from the wall's shadow, crackling softly as I walked. The thing beyond the splintered gates had not followed, but its presence stayed with me, a weight in my chest, a chill in my bones. The city felt different now. Quieter, yet somehow more awake. I had the distinct sense that Ani was not just watching me anymore. It was waiting. The path ahead wound down toward the river. The moon lit it in fragments, spilling silver over jagged stones and broken columns. Between the skeletal silhouettes of buildings, I could see the faint glimmer of water through a low mist. And then, as the path straightened, I saw it. The bridge. It stretched across the river in a perfect stone arc, so slender it seemed to float above the mist rather than rest upon it. The balustrades were low, carved with looping patterns so worn they seemed like half-forgotten words. Time had not touched the bridge as it had the rest of the city. No cracks marred its surface, no vines gripped its edges. It was as if it had been built yesterday. I stopped at its base, and the air seemed to change. The wind dropped away, replaced by an almost oppressive stillness. Even the sound of the river, loud and restless everywhere else, was muted here, its roar distant and muffled. I remembered what the villagers had told me days ago, before I entered Ani. Do not cross the bridge unless you are ready to lose something. At the time, I had taken it for local superstition, another warning in a long chain of them. But looking at it now, I understood their tone. It hadn't been caution. It had been certainty. The old tale said Ani kept more than its master keys and its locked doors. It kept parts of those who entered, memories, names, pieces of the self you couldn't name until they were gone. The bridge was where the keeping began. Crossing into Ani without leaving something behind would be like trying to breathe without exhaling. Impossible. I set one foot on the stone. The change was immediate, a sensation subtle but unmistakable, like a hand brushing through my thoughts. It wasn't rifling through them, not yet, only feeling their shape. I took another step. The mist below stirred faintly, curling upward between the balustrades. Halfway across, the air grew heavier, as though each step carried more weight than my body alone could bear. The river below was hidden completely now by the mist, which rolled and shifted in slow, deliberate swirls. It wasn't moving with the wind, it was moving to some rhythm I could not hear. That was when I saw them. Shapes ahead of me, faint at first, like shadows on the bridge. They grew more distinct as I drew closer, resolving into human forms. My pace slowed. The figures were walking toward me, but their movements were strange, precise, deliberate, as if each step had been measured and rehearsed. And then, as the nearest one lifted its head, I understood. It was me. The same height, the same face, the same clothes I wore now. Even the way it walked, that slight hitch in the left leg from an old injury, was identical. Its eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt an odd flicker of recognition, not of another person but of a reflection in a mirror you've looked into for too long. There were more behind it. 5, 6, a dozen shadowed versions of me, each slightly different. One's face was gaunt and pale, its eyes hollow. Another's gaze was sharp, almost predatory. Another seemed older, lines etched deep around its mouth. They passed one another as they walked, some toward me, some away, but none spoke. I kept moving forward, my steps slow, my eyes locked on the figure closest to me. It drew nearer until we stood only an arm's length apart. I stopped. It stopped. The air between us felt taut, like a wire pulled too tight. I realized my breath had quickened, and then I noticed, so had its. The sound was the same, the rise and fall in perfect unison. It raised its hand. At first, I thought it meant to mirror me, but then it reached out, fingers stretching toward my shoulder. The mist swirled upward around us, curling over the balustrades like pale smoke. Every instinct screamed to step back, but my body didn't move. The fingers touched my arm. Cold. Not the natural chill of frost, but a deep, empty cold, as if the heat it stole was not for itself but for the space behind it. My vision swam at the edges, and for a heartbeat, the world doubled. I saw the bridge, the mist, the figure before me, and overlaid upon it all, another image, me, standing at the far end of the bridge, looking back, my face unreadable. The grip tightened. I felt something shift inside me, not in my muscles, not in my bones, deeper. A thread pulling loose, a faint but undeniable sense that something I had carried all my life was slipping away. I tried to pull free. The figure's eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw movement there, a faint, almost imperceptible smile. And then, without warning, it yanked me forward. The balustrade hit my hip. My balance broke. The mist rose to meet me as I fell. Ruins should be dead. Ani still inhales. The mist swallowed me whole when I fell from the bridge. I didn't strike stone, or water, or earth. I struck nothing, and yet I did not stop falling. I hung there, suspended in a weightless dark, as though the world had folded in on itself and left me adrift between its layers. Then something shifted. A faint vibration brushed against me, not in the air but in my own ribs. It came again, stronger, until I realized it was not just sound, it was breath. Long, slow, deliberate inhalations, each one drawing me deeper into the dark. The mist thinned. The ground rose up to meet me. I landed gently, as though the breath itself had laid me down. I stood in a chamber so vast that its walls were swallowed by shadow. The air was warm, damp, and alive with a rhythmic pulse, a deep expansion and contraction, the chamber itself swelling and falling as though it were the chest of some great sleeping creature. The sound was not entirely physical. I felt it in my bones, in the blood moving through my veins. In the dim, shifting light, I saw them. Every face from my journey. They stood in silent rows, not statues, not entirely living, something between. Stone, flesh, and ghost, each bound in the form they had held when I had met them. The robed choir from the catacombs, their hoods drawn low. The woman in the wind, her veil still drifting though no air stirred. The child's wide eyes from the morning Ani died, frozen in the reflection of that black sky. The shadow versions of myself from the bridge, unmoving but alert, and behind them, faces I had never seen, and yet recognized in some deep, unspoken way. Farmers, soldiers, merchants, kings, queens crowned in gold, priests with eyes hollowed by knowledge too heavy to hold. They were all watching. I wanted to speak, to ask what this place was, but my voice caught. The chamber itself seemed to be listening, and I understood instinctively that to speak here without being asked was to risk more than silence. From the far end of the hall came movement. It was slow, deliberate, each step accompanied by the faint hiss of fabric on stone. A figure emerged from the shadows, taller than any I had seen in Ani, wrapped in robes the color of deep earth. The hood was pulled low, but when it lifted its head, I saw no face, only the smooth curve of featureless stone, polished to a dull sheen. When it spoke, it was not with a mouth, but with the sound of the breath itself. You have walked the streets. You have seen the gates. You have carried the key. Its voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was the city. I felt the weight of the blackened key in my pocket. It seemed to warm at the words. The figure circled me slowly. Many have entered. Few have come to the heart. Fewer still have come with a voice. I found my breath. What is this place? This, the city said, is the breath you hear in your dreams. This is the space between Ani's last heartbeat and its next. The air thickened, pressing against my chest. I realized the inhalations I had felt since waking here were not the chambers alone. I was breathing in time with it now, as though my own lungs had fallen under its rhythm. You think Ani was abandoned, the voice continued. You think walls crumble only for time, and markets fall silent only for hunger. But Ani did not fall. Ani closed. I swallowed. Closed. The faceless head inclined. We built our gates to keep out armies. But an army was never the danger. We built our walls to keep in our treasures. But it was never gold the city kept. I thought of the stories, the bridge that stole memories, the gate that read truth, the river that ran backward, the keys that opened what should remain sealed. What did the city keep? The stone face turned toward the endless rows of watching figures. Us. The breath swelled again, heavier now, as if every figure in the chamber exhaled together. When the last queen made her bargain, when the river turned against us, when the walls shuddered without an enemy, we understood Ani could not survive in the open world. So we drew in our breath and held it. We became stone to the eye, dust to the hand, but alive in the space beneath. And the people? I asked, my voice a whisper. The faceless head tilted again toward the silent rows. We are the people. Flesh, ghost, memory, all drawn into the breath. Waiting. For what? I asked. The figure stepped closer until the polished stone was inches from my face. For the right voice to call us back. The words settled on me like a cloak I could not remove. My mind raced. Why me? The city inhaled again, and the sound filled every space inside me. Because you have walked our streets without closing your eyes. Because you have taken the key without dropping it. Because every face you have seen still stands before you. You did not turn away. The truth of it burned in my chest. I realized that every strange pull, every impossible turn of the path since I arrived, had led here. Not to history, not to ruin, to this moment. And if I call you back? I asked. The city's breath deepened until I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. Then the gates will open, and Ani will breathe out. The faces in the rows seemed to lean forward, just slightly, as though the words were not for me alone, but for all of them. I could almost hear them, not with my ears, but in the space between heartbeats. They were waiting. I thought of what it would mean. A city returned from stone and silence. Streets filled again with voices. Markets alive. Bells ringing. But I also thought of what else might return. The river's curse, the siege without an army, the watchers in the bridge's mist. Once opened, the city said, "We will not close again." The breath slowed, the chamber stilling with it. Say the words, or leave. My hand went to the key in my pocket. The metal was warm now, pulsing faintly in time with the chamber. Every figure's gaze, stone, flesh, or shadow, was on me. The silence after the last breath was complete. I could feel the choice pressing against my tongue. And then I spoke. Open the gates. The chamber exhaled. The sound was like mountains breaking, like the sky tearing from horizon to horizon. Dust rose from the floor in curling clouds. The rows of faces dissolved into motion, stone crumbling to skin, shadow solidifying into bone and flesh. The breath roared upward through unseen passages, racing toward the surface. Somewhere far above, I heard it, the groan of gates stirring in their hinges, the splintering of wood and iron long dormant. The city was waking. The faceless figure stepped back into shadow, its voice fading but still inside my chest. The breath returns. The ground shuddered. Light spilled into the edges of the chamber, too bright to be the moon's, too quick to be dawn. The figures began to move toward it, some walking, some gliding, some simply fading into the brilliance. I felt it pulling me upward, through stone, through earth, through streets that no longer lay in ruin. For an instant, I saw Ani whole, the golden spires, the river full, the gates wide. And then it was gone, replaced by a rushing black. The last thing I heard was my own whisper, carried on the city's breath as everything faded. Open the gates. Even now, somewhere beyond the veil of time, Ani exhales. its breath curling through stone corridors, along empty bridges, and into the dreams of those who dare to listen. Perhaps tonight, you will hear it too. Perhaps you will wake, certain you've walked streets you have never set foot upon, carrying memories that are not your own. And if you do, you will know the city is not gone. Only waiting for another voice, waiting for another gate to open. There are countless places like Ani, lost cities, cursed lands, and forgotten kingdoms whose stones remember more than history will admit. Their stories are written not in books, but in the wind, in the earth, and in the silence between heartbeats. If you wish to walk further into that silence, if you wish to stand where the living meet the shadows of the past, stay with us. There are more gates to open, more breaths to follow, more truths that will not rest quietly. Like this story if it found its way under your skin. Share it so that others may hear the breath of forgotten places. And subscribe, so the next time a city calls, you will be among the first to answer. Because some doors can only be unlocked together.